now, let's actually talk about Pyre.
All right.
You reviewed it.
I did.
What'd you think?
I really liked it.
Okay. It seemed like, here's my outside perspective. It seems cool. Seems like you liked it. And then towards the end, you're like, oh boy, this is longer than I thought. Which I thought was going to be a downside, but then you ended up giving it an 8.75?
Yeah, I mean, it is a longer game than what they've done before. It's more of a classic RPG experience where you're dealing with a whole party of characters that you're developing over time. And there's something that happens about, I would say maybe somewhere between a third and halfway through the game that opens it up and makes the entire experience be sort of more free form. And that has both good things about it and bad things about it. But I will say that it does what every one of that studio's games has done up to this point, which is to blow me away with originality.
Totally.
Right? Like the way that they approach storytelling and world creation and the integration of art and gameplay and music and character creation is in such a way that you always feel like there's some aspect of that you just don't totally understand, but that's okay, right? Like that this is a world you're just being dropped into, and it has a depth of history to it and a depth of character relationships that predate what is happening in the story.
But something we talk about in the interview later on in the show, something this game does that's so smart is in all dialogue, sometimes when there's like a key word, a key pronoun, I guess, you can kind of hover over it and it'll give you the backstory. It's like building a wiki into your game, and it works so well for just like, wait, what was that word again? How does this relate to that? What is the downside?
Hey, real quick, what is this game? I don't know.
All right, so here we
question.
go. Pyre's a game about you are an exile that has been flung down into a world that exists sort of beneath the normal world. And in the normal world, there's this kind of unjust theocracy that is the ruling order of the day. And in the Commonwealth is the name of this land.
Cork, it's a NBA Jam RPG.
Okay, thank you.
And
go on, Miller.
And they fling their exiles. I was going to get there.
I'm sure you were.
They fling their criminals and their exiles and their undesirables down into this other land called the Downside. And within that world, the only way to find freedom is to fight in the rights, which is really just an excuse for Supergiant Games to put in a old school arcade sports game in their fantasy RPG as the sort of central gameplay loop.
So it's like Blitzball.
But with basically. But there's a bunch of story and characters
in Final Fantasy
and that kind of thing.
Okay.
So I'm still confused about the larger structure and the larger loop. I've just played like the first hour of the game, and it's a lot of reading.
It is,
which is fine. It's well written from what I've seen so far, and then jump to a battle. Does it maintain just that simple loop of like storytelling decisions and then jump into a battle throughout the entire game?
Through the entire game, you're always returning to the rights. There's not the idea that somehow you get partway through the game and like, oh my, now it's totally changed and we're not doing this battle sport anymore. That is what the game is about, is conducting these rights, winning or losing them, and then continuing on past there. It does change a little bit as there are more characters that join your party, and each one of those has different abilities that helps to make the game, the sport game, a little bit more kind of varied and challenging.
Yeah.
And you also have a point where it completely opens up and you begin going back to previous places that you've been and fighting groups that you've already fought once, a second or third time.
And that's okay?
It is okay because they continue the narrative loop of developing relationships between those characters, right? So in the first time you fight them, you might learn about one of your characters has a sister who's on one of the opponent's teams. And there's some sibling rivalry there that's really deep, and there's a lot of betrayals and anger that's left over there. And we introduce that in the first fight that we see them. But the next time, if you happen to encounter them again, that story then continues, and we learn more about that relationship between these two sisters.
Hey, Miller.
Yeah.
Is this kind of like the role that competitive bending played in Legend of Korra?
Yeah.
Interesting.
It is. That's actually an interesting comparison because what happens in that story is that you have very distinct relationships that are unfolding through drama that happens outside of the sport, but then the drama is carried out onto the field and plays into what happens in the sport.
Right.
Now, there's some things that make the game even more compelling beyond that. But one of the biggest things is that the game has a continuous flow without save points, really. That was impressive.
Go on.
We're listening.
So, no save points.
Completely.
Well, no fail states would be maybe the better way to say it, right? If you lose a match in this game, the game continues going, and the consequences of what happens carry through to the rest of the game, even in really important matches.
Like Colony Wars. That sounds amazing.
So when you can have situations arise where you're really planning around like, okay, this is what I'm going to do with my team, and like there becomes a certain point where you retire your players, sort of. But in so doing, I mean, it's sort of built into the structure of the concept, right? Like this is how you get freedom for your characters, right? Is they're involved in the rights.
Oh, so you grant them their freedom once you've worn them out.
So you're trying to sort of like get them freedom, right? But if the natural conclusion of that is the idea that like your best players sometimes, and the ones who are most dear to your heart that you want to like offer the chance for like escaping this torture and this bad place, they're now no longer a part of your team, and you have to kind of continue on without them. And there's a real sense of like loss there, both in terms of like, oh man, that guy was really good on the field, but it was also like, I liked the conversations I had with them.
JV, this is like the end of Aladdin when he has to free the genie, and it's very emotional. But then he puts on the goofy hat and goes to Disneyland or whatever.
He's just translating for JV into terms.
I'm trying to help.
He's trying to wake JV up. For the people who are just
like
listening, JV has not left the room. He's still with us.
No, like I'm paying attention because the thing is like, okay, I'm gonna play it because Supergiant Games is great. Like Bastion's one of my favorite games of all time. I was less in love with Transistor, but that's fine. But with sort of sportsy games, like my main issue here is like, okay, let's take this sort of alternate sports genre, right? Like we have Rocket League, and the hook with Rocket League is clear. It's RC cars with, soccer.
Flip and kickballs. Right?
Yeah. And then like desert golfing is really cool because it like pares away everything down to this frustrating but really sort of gripping experience that you can play on the go.
Endless torture.
Yeah. No, it's a weird game. It's a game for weirdos like me who are into masochism, I guess. But like, what's the hook for this outside of the Supergiant thing? Like, that is what I'm waiting for, that no one has like explained it to me. What is the hook for Pyre that exists outside of that studio?
I think the sport itself was way more fun than I thought it was going to be.
Interesting.
I think I went into it with a perception of it being, if anybody can think back to some of the earliest of those classic arcade sports, you might recall like old ice hockey, right? Where you have like the big slow guy, the small fast guy, right? And at least at the beginning of Pyre, that's what you're starting with. You said you played the first hour.
Yeah.
So you have a sense of that, right?
Clear archetypes, yeah.
Very clear archetypes, but they all have very similar abilities, and like you'd feel like, oh, well, this is kind of neat, but it's hard for me to see much depth here.
That's where I'm at.
Fair?
It's like even like a skill tree popped up, and it's like, okay, pretty basic abilities. I can't imagine playing this for what? How long is the game overall?
It's between 15 and 20 some hours.
Seems like a lot for what I've seen so far, but what does it add?
So the subsequent classes that you're getting change up that game, and those classes are also beginning to show up on your opponent teams, and you have to account for them. So to give you an example, there's a class late in the game that's basically like a tree person, right? Like a treant kind of guy, right?
Okay.
And they can put a sapling out onto the field that creates its own aura, right? Its own protective aura that just is a stationary spot on the field. They can also teleport by dropping down on the ground and zipping across and reappearing as a tree someplace else. And they can generate a personal shield that blocks attacks, right? So a completely different skill set from the starting ability sets of those characters that you begin with at the beginning. And you're choosing who you put out in the roster. You're also looking at what the opponent team has fielded, seeing what their abilities are, and trying to balance against that.
So it turns into more of a hero-based game than we realize.
It does.
Okay.
It does.
So are the other characters people?
Yes.
So why do you care if Why is a tree that can teleport?
Well, you start with a dog on your team, so
You
I mean,
do.
it's a little loosey-goosey.
It's like a talking tree. Like it's totally a fantasy world,
Okay.
right?
We glossed over that.
and
Well,
so
we
you
can't
have-
stress enough that this world is wild. Yeah, like Miller said,
okay.
it's super unique.
It's
out of the
super
gate.
weird. There's talking dogs and talking trees. There's like one of your characters at a certain point is a bog witch. There's a whole race of like weird worms that live in the sea.
What is this, Bungie?
And each one of them, brings a different set of abilities to the table. But you also get to know the individual that's on your team and have conversations with them and see what their motivations are, learn about their history, learn about their regrets. And so there is that kind of RPG storytelling core, but then you're getting back into this sport all the time.
Yeah, it just feels like the only reason that I would be interested in playing this is because Supergiant is involved. Just because I have not, like, it just sounds so complex. Like, I'm not saying that, like, you're doing a bad job of selling this game to me. It just sounds like there's so many ideas going on here. There's, like, RPG branching stuff. There's, like, a sports game.
Well, keep in mind, it's basically a text adventure outside of the arcade sports game, right?
I think that to be fair, JV, it is as complex as you're describing. There's a lot of different ideas at play here, and the world is very complicated. The sport itself does, like, the full complexity of it takes a while to get under your belt to master. But that's kind of it's also gradually introduced that I don't think it comes across as overwhelming. Has your experience in the first hour been that you felt totally overwhelmed?
It seems all right. The part that's so confusing to me is like the stars, where it'll make you look at the sky and it's like, I don't know how many choices I have here. I don't know if I should be scanning around or it's pretty linear.
In the beginning, it is relatively linear.
You're choosing where to go next, and it's like looking up the
skies. It starts out
skies.
almost like a road trip story, right? Where you have this like wagon that you and your party are traveling across the countryside, going to these different battles, right? These rites.
Yeah.
But wherever possible, they create allusions to the sports dynamic that they're talking about, right? There is the idea, as I referred to before, that you're eventually having to retire your best and most experienced characters. There's the idea at one point that you begin to have, like, there are fans. Mm-hmm. It's all couched within this fantasy RPG setting, so I don't want to spoil too much. But there's like a fan group that begins to follow different teams around. There's a person on your team who's effectively a manager that's tracking your win-loss ratio and the win-loss ratio of all the other teams that are out there.
Yeah.
And so that you can determine who you want to go up against next. There's the idea even that, like, you can have a character who gets injured in a match, and so they're out for the next match.
Is this the greatest sports campaign mode ever created?
I really think that it might be.
So bizarre.
It's super bizarre, but that is what I like about Supergiant Games stuff, is that without fail, each of the 3 games that they have released has been very unusual and has just gone for it.
There's
right?
no chance another studio would have stumbled across a similar game.
No.
Yeah.
No, like it's completely original and very different. And it also has, to take it back, JV, to your point, I don't think it's a point to be ignored that, like, the only reason you said the only reason I might play this was that it's a Supergiant Games game, right?
Oh, I will play it because it's Supergiant.
And that's another important takeaway here, right? Like, Supergiant has this lush, vibrant art style, has the world building chops that would compete with any other studio. I would put them up against BioWare. I would put them up against Bethesda,
Psionics,
like Arcane. I mean, I think they have that tier of smart world building that they're doing. They have a musical partner that they bring back for every one of their games, and there's always these sort of like poignant sung musical tracks that are introduced at certain moments in the game, and sure enough, you're probably not there yet, but they kind of like save that, and you have those moments where you're like, okay, this is a really cool scene. I can tell because we now have this like this song being sung, right?
Wojcik? Cameo?
So that the aesthetic experience of Supergiant Games product is very much present here.
Yeah.
But they're just trying something that's a little bit further afield than what they'd had with Bastion,
including a PvP mode, which is pretty different for them.
Yeah. So in addition, I don't want to make too big of a deal of that because it's it's a local mode for just 2 players. You can't play it online or anything, but there is a competitive. Like I think it'd be best for 2 people who'd like finished the game, who understood all the skills and understood all the characters. You can actually go in, play local couch local couch competitive play with any of the characters that are in the game, including ones that are enemy players.
That you've encountered in the campaign so far.
Yes,
okay.
And so you go through and you can experiment with different team makeups, and you can play against AI without having to worry about how it's going to affect your campaign. You can set up AI and what match board do I want to play on, because there's different setups of like the obstacles that are out on the board.
Yeah.
What characters do I want? What difficulty do I want? And it just lets you dig deeper into the actual sport experience, and it's a good bit of fun.
Right on. So, dumb specs, PC, PS4 only right now.
That's right.
There we go. 875 for Matt Miller.
I liked it a lot. I think if you're looking for something that's just a little bit different this summer, this is a good option.
This is the way to go. Thank you so much for watching this excerpt from the Game Informer Show podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version and listen to new episodes airing every Thursday. We cover big games on the horizon, games that we've just reviewed. We have long-form developer interviews, a lot of fun stuff. So check it out every Thursday.